This video is to help you to understand the material from the classwork for section 2.1.1. First of all, at the beginning of any unit, you'll notice that they will talk about what are the overall ideas that will be covered in that unit. So they talk about the fact that you'll be working with displaying data, you'll be investigating area, find the relationship between area and perimeter and how changing one might affect another. Focusing then on multiplication and visualizing it in a different way. So those will be some of the concepts. And then here you also see the guiding questions for the unit. So for the learning target for 2.1.1, it's analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of various graphical representations. So first of all, the idea of a dot plot. So they have an example here. In class, we'd be creating a dot plot. But if we just look at this one, the idea of a dot plot, first of all, is that it's a way to represent information visually. They should normally have put a title on it. Just putting a title of dot plot is not a very good title. We probably, in this sample situation, would have put something like the number of pets of students in class. And then you should have a label on the bottom as well. And you should go by ones along the bottom. So this does not necessarily have to start at 0, but whatever value you start at, it's going to need to then go by ones. All right. So that right away brings up sort of a limitation of a dot plot. If you have data that's really spread apart and there's not a lot of repeated data, you would not typically use a dot plot. But if you look at the example they have basically 2 students who have 0 pets. They have 5 that have 1 pet, 3 that have 2, and so forth. So this would be a good set of data to use a dot plot on because the numbers are very close together and there's a lot of repeated values. There's a lot of students that have 1 pet. There's a lot of students that have 2 pets, and so on. Then when you look at the idea of a bar graph, which of course you've done in elementary school as well, again, there should be a title to it. You should have your labels on the bottom. And then what we usually use along the vertical is the word frequency, which just means how many. So if you wanted to look at an example, if there were 5 students that had dogs, then you would come up to where you would approximate 5 to be. Well, if this is 4 and this is 8, then this would be 6. So 5 would be about halfway there. And then you'd come down and say, okay, about 5 students have dogs. Okay. Again, you need to go by even intervals here, but not necessarily by 1. So in this case, I went by 2. So we've got 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. Again, even though I don't have the numbers marked for these, you know, the 2 and the 6 and the 10, we know that those are represented by the lines. All right. One of the limitations, though, with something like this is you might know, how many students have a dog, how many students have a cat, but it doesn't really show you how many students have neither or how many students have both. So again, that would be a limitation of a bar graph. When they did their bar graph, they showed the dots inside of it, and the reason they did that is to show you how it's actually quite closely associated with the idea of a dot plot. Number of dots is the same as the frequency or representing the height of the bar. Now for a Venn diagram, which again I assume you've seen before, that's a good visual representation when you have an area of overlap. So if we had, let's say, 5 students that said they had dogs, and let's say we had, 10 students that said they had cats, but let's say we also had 4 that said they had both, and maybe 6 that have neither, then the way that we would represent that in our Venn diagram is the 6 that have neither would be out here because they're not obviously going to be included at all. The 4 that have both would be included in this area of overlap. And then what we'd want to remember is this circle represents dogs, but that includes the 4 that have both. So if we have 5 students that have dogs, but of those 4 have both dogs and cats, they're already represented here. So we only have 1 additional student that has just a dog. If we have 10 that have cats, but again, 4 are represented in the area of overlap, then we have 6 that have just cats. So the idea here is that this section is representing just dogs, people who have just dogs. This section is representing people who have, I'll do my best to do this, just cats. And then the area in the middle, of course, is representing those who have both. Okay, so as you figure out what numbers go where, you want to make sure you're thinking about the fact that that full circle is representing the 5 dogs, that full circle is representing the 10 cats, and that includes that area of overlap. All right. And then you want to look at a set of data and say, you know, what do you think would be the best way to visually display that data? Would you use a dot plot? Would you use a bar graph? Would you use a Venn diagram? And what you should be looking for is, again, you know, do you have a lot of repeated values? Do you have categories? Oftentimes when we have categories, we would do a bar graph versus with a dot plot, we're usually using numbers along the bottom here, again, going by ones, okay? And again, do you have overlap? And if you don't have overlap, then a Venn diagram really doesn't make much sense. All right. Again, though, if you look at this set of data, it would make more sense to go with a dot plot because all these numbers are very closely aligned. And also they are numbers, and going by ones would make sense, and you're going to have a lot of repeated values. All right. So those are the things you'd want to consider. We'll have a separate video on homework kids. Thank you.